Morning, friends. I'm Dr. Malia Jones. I am the editor-in-chief at Dear Pandemic, and I'm back from vacation. Happy to be back. I am so delighted this week to be welcoming the two women who make the magic happen over at the Unbiased Science podcast. I have today with me Dr. Jessica Steyer, who is a public health expert, and Dr. Andrea Love, who is an immunologist. Thanks for joining me this morning.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Dr. Jones, for having us. We're super excited to be with Dear Pandemic today.
Yeah, I'm excited too. This has been a long time in the making. So I want to know, why did you call your podcast the Unbiased Science Podcast?
That is a good question. And we discussed this. We ruminated on this for a very long time. But basically, we don't just want to talk or communicate with people who think as we do, right? We really want to reach across the aisle. So we want to make sure that we're leaving politics at the door, let people know that no, pharma is not paying us. We don't have any ulterior motives. All we do is present the unbiased facts. So we live in the world of data. Everything that we say is evidence-based. We provide sources for everything we say. And we want to make sure that we're not excluding anyone from the conversation. Andrea, I didn't know if you had anything to add there.
Jess kind of summed it up. I think, one of the challenges we saw, especially during the pandemic, is how politicized science has become. And we want to make sure that anybody who has an interest in science, because of course we cover topics unrelated to COVID as well. So anybody that has an interest in any of these science or health related topics can feel welcomed to, join us, learn from us without fearing that we're going to have some sort of, internal bias or internal slant to the information that we're providing.
Yeah. Dear Pandemic has really leaned in on that idea that science and policy should be partners and not adversaries. And I agree. I see the politicization of public health is a serious barrier to, public health achieving its mission. So absolutely, I really appreciate that. So I need to send out a huge thank you to Bridges for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing in Tennessee, who are providing live closed captioning services and ASL interpretation for us today. If you are using these services, we'd love to know about it. Just put a note in the comments, and that helps us understand who's using them and keep the services going too. So just as a reminder, we don't take questions cold on our live show. If you have a question, you can submit it in our question box, which is on our website, dearpandemic.org. And while you're there, you can try a search for your question. We have answered almost 1,000 questions over the last 54 weeks and counting. And so your answer might just be waiting for you there. You can also check out the Unbiased Science Podcast Facebook page and their website, because they have also done some terrific posts lately on some topics that we're getting a ton of questions about, like especially kids and vaccines. I noticed you guys have done a bunch of great ones. You have a question box too, is that right?
We do, yeah. So on our website, you can drop a question for our Heard from the Herd segment that we do on every week. It looks better when it's spelled, right? But so we often, sometimes we'll just reply to a person because it goes into our email inbox. Sometimes we'll actually feature it as one of the topics on the podcast episode. And then sometimes we'll use it for a social media post. So all of those messages are read and we do something with them.
Yeah, I read every one of them too. I admit I'm a little behind because I had the last 2 weeks off, so I have not read the whole backlog yet, but it's on my list.
So
I'm sure you deserve the break.
So I noticed your most recent podcast episode was about Lyme disease, and I would love to know, what is the one thing that you wish everyone knew about Lyme disease, aside from the fact that it does not end in an S? It's Lyme disease,
it's Lyme,
not limes.
Right. Lyme, after the town in Connecticut near where I grew up. So the one thing that I wish everybody knew is that there is a phenomenal amount of misinformation about Lyme disease. And there are a lot of people, particularly in the wellness sector, that propagate dangerous and unfounded treatments and testing for Lyme disease. It's actually a relatively straightforward infection and disease. And my hope is that through our podcast series on that, we can dispel a lot of the misinformation. And I did my doctoral dissertation on Lyme disease and the immunology of infection. So I feel very, very passionately about that.
And Andrew, one other thing that you always drive home, which wasn't apparent to me, is that Lyme disease is caused by bacteria, right? Which is treatable by antibiotic.
Yeah.
And so that's also something that I don't think that people realize.
You know, it's funny, on our sort of back channel chat before this live, we were talking about it. I do a lot of foraging in Wisconsin. And so the foraging networks have a ton of exposure to Lyme disease. And this just came up in one of the foraging channels on Facebook that I follow. And, you know, somebody asked about an herbal treatment for Lyme. And there were essentially 97 comments that said, go to a doctor, you need antibiotics. It's not something you can treat with herbs. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that's very important, and I see a lot of myths circulating, is that it's transmitted by the bite of an infected tick. In the US, there are only 2 species of tick that actually can transmit it, and not all of them are even infected to begin with. But the best practice is a good defense. So tick repellents, they're very effective repellents. You can use pesticide treatments like permethrin on your clothing, and tick checks anytime you're out in the woods, especially in the areas where it is more prevalent, which is the Northeast where I live and the Midwest where you live.
Yeah.
Those are the best. The best offense is that defense.
Yeah, I whenever I'm in the woods, I wear I have a special pair of socks and pants that have been treated with an insect repellent, a long-acting insect repellent, and I wear
Andrew,
those.
you said, oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I tuck my pants into my socks.
Yes. Because then you'll see them climbing up, because they're not going to land on your head. They're going to start from the ground.
Exactly.
They do this thing called questing, which is the most adorable thing on the planet. So ticks climb up a blade of grass and they hold on with their back legs and they wave their front legs around in the air. And they literally are just waiting for something to walk past them to grab onto. They are not very mobile. They really rely on something passing them to attach.
And Andrew, I'm not very
That's definitely
adventurous.
the first time I've ever heard a tick called adorable.
We say this all the time. No, but I was just going to say I'm not very adventurous at all. But Andrea, you said that growing up outdoors all the time, you've been bitten by hundreds of ticks, and you've never
gotten any tick-borne illness. Yeah, ever.
Okay, so let's get to reader questions. I have my first question, sort of a quickie here. We've got a question from Sharon from Phoenix, who wants to know, is it safe to try on clothes at a store or a secondhand store like Goodwill after I've been vaccinated? What do you think?
That's a great question. I would say that trying on secondhand clothes in and of itself, no, that's not dangerous, right? So we know now that fomite transmission, picking up the virus from a surface that's been touched by someone that's infected, or has spittle from someone who's been infected, that's unlikely to get you infected with COVID, right? But people, it's so funny, people send us these questions all the time with these scenarios, and I always want to say, well, there are so many other variables, right? So are you in close quarters with other people? Are the other people vaccinated? Are they high risk? So, it's tough without all the context, but trying on secondhand clothes in and of itself is certainly not a danger.
So I always come back to, we get a ton of questions that are phrased just like this. Is it safe?
Mm-hmm.
And I really try to reframe those as, nothing, no epidemiologist. I mean, we deal in risk. Nothing is safe. It's not safe, period, the end, to stand in your backyard alone, right? Like a meteor could hit you. I don't know. But what we do is try to make it safer. Mm-hmm. So reframing that, is it safe, to safer, and what can you do to make it safer?
Yeah, exactly. And I would echo those same sentiments, trying on clothing that came from another person. I mean, ideally thrift stores or secondhand stores are laundering, or they're accepting freshly laundered clothes, which is going to obviously improve or reduce that risk. But it's, the being in the physical store, right? Are you wearing your mask?
Right.
Are other people wearing their masks? And even if you're vaccinated, we know that vaccines are not 100% effective. Nothing is. So the risk is much lower when you're vaccinated, but in public spaces, we still want to be wearing those masks.
Right. Okay, so next question. Should I get an antibody test after I get vaccinated to see if it worked?
So we've actually gotten that question too. And I think, a lot of people want to know, right? Especially people that were participating in clinical trials. They wanted to see if they were in the placebo or the vaccine group. So the issue comes up where when you think about what the vaccine is made of, the vaccine, whether it's Moderna or Pfizer or Johnson and Johnson, it's using just a little piece of the virus, right? So we're triggering our body to make that spike protein. So when we get vaccinated, our antibodies are only specific to the spike protein. And the issue becomes is that the antibody tests for COVID-19 were made for the whole virus. And I'm going to use my little plushie here as a visual aid. So this is the COVID virus. Shout out to Giant Microbes. I love their stuff. But so the spike are these yellow pieces, right? And so that's the only protein of the virus that our body will make antibodies against when we get vaccinated. The rest of the virus has a lot of other proteins, right? And so this red portion of the virus is made up of proteins called nucleocapsid. And when you get infected with the actual virus, you make antibodies to all of the pieces. So some of the antibody tests are not looking for antibodies for the spike protein. They're looking for the other protein, the nucleocapsid. So if you get that antibody test after your vaccination, you're not going to test positive. You shouldn't. It would be very unusual. If you get an antibody test for the spike protein, you might test positive. But we know different people produce different levels of antibodies. So, it's generally not recommended to get that antibody test to see if it worked, because it could confuse you. It might frustrate you. You might, be unsure about it. Just trust in the vaccination. We have the efficacy data. We know that they're very effective in real world settings now.
So Jess, maybe you can answer this follow-up question, which is American Red Cross and other blood donation centers are routinely testing for antibodies after people donate blood. And do you know which type of antibody test, or if that one would we expect that to be positive after vaccination?
I don't actually know which test they're using. Andrew, do you know?
I don't. And I want to say it may be site specific, but I did add a link for the kind of list of FDA authorized. So if you are donating blood at a Red Cross and you ask them, they should be able to provide that information to you. And so then you can kind of see, oh, well, is it for the spike protein? And if that's the case, then maybe you will test positive. But if it's for the other one and you've been vaccinated, then you wouldn't test positive.
Yeah. So if you do donate blood and you get antibody results back that say you have no antibodies after you're vaccinated, that doesn't necessarily mean the vaccine didn't work, right? That's
Exactly.
kind of it might just be that the
Takeaway.
test was looking for the other thing.
Yep, exactly.
The red part of your plushie. I have one of those guys too. Mine's purple. You see him?
I said, oh, I do. We are all nerds.
Okay, so next one, question from Anne from Sandpoint, Idaho, who wants to know, can getting the vaccine cause you to test positive on either an antigen or PCR test? So just to set this up, I don't want to confuse anybody. We were just talking about antibody tests. That's the blood test that would tell you if your immune system has already responded to and is ready to respond again to COVID-19, the virus that causes COVID-19. Antigen and PCR test for whether you are infected currently, right? So it's a different kind of test we're talking about. So what do you think? Can the vaccine make you test positive?
So I'll give the big picture answer, and then I'll turn it to Andrea to really speak to the immunology of it. But the short answer is absolutely not. You cannot test positive from getting vaccinated. The vaccine cannot give you COVID. There is absolutely no virus present in any of the vaccines that are authorized for use right now. And Andrea can give you the science of it. But when we see that people are testing positive after being vaccinated, it does not mean that the vaccine gave them the virus, right? It could mean a few different things. It can mean that you were exposed prior to your first dose, if you're getting a 2-dose regimen. It could mean that you were exposed in between your 2 doses before you fully mounted an antibody response and mounted that protection. Or you could be one of those rare cases where there's a breakthrough case of COVID, where you do get COVID even after being fully vaccinated. And we know that these are very rare instances. But as Andrea said, vaccines are not 100, they don't provide 100% protection, right? Nothing does, not even seatbelts, yet we continue to use seatbelts because we know that those still provide protection. But Andrea, did you want to dig into the science of it a bit?
Yeah, not too much. So I think the big takeaway is, yes, those tests are looking for detection of pieces of the virus in your body, whether or not you're actually infected. The big thing to consider, so the vaccine is technically creating the spike protein, right, in your body, but that's intramuscular, that's in your arm. When they're collecting a sample for the test for infection, it's from your nose or your mouth. That's where the virus lives when you're infected. So there's no way that even if you had recently gotten vaccinated, that the spike proteins from the vaccine are going to get up into your respiratory tract. And then when you get a swab, it's going to test positive. That's just not biologically possible. So a lot of it has to do with where they're collecting that sample from.
Interesting. Yeah, so we're going to put in a link here that is actually, so going back to Jess's point about those breakthrough cases, I wrote up this response to a question that we get all the time at Dear Pandemic, which is, so how likely are those breakthrough cases, right? Does 95% efficacy mean I have a 5% chance of catching COVID after I'm vaccinated? And, the answer to that question is essentially no. The efficacy data they don't really measure our individual level risk.
Right.
The best estimates we have for how frequent those breakthrough cases are it's very, very rare.
Very rare.
For example, in the clinical trial, it was 11 people out of 15,000 who had symptomatic COVID after they were vaccinated in the treatment group.
Right. And even if you are one of those rare breakthrough cases, we know that the vaccines are really good at preventing you from getting very sick, from those complications, from hospitalization, and of course, from death. So vaccines are pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And I think one thing to keep in mind, because everybody wants to know, what's my individual risk after I'm vaccinated, right? So the efficacy and effectiveness data is population level. We're looking at how many people are testing positive or getting infected, either in a study group or at population level. And, the immune system is incredibly diverse and complex, and it varies from person to person. And so some people have a more robust immune response than others. And certain medical conditions can make your immune system less robust. So those would be situations where you're immunocompromised or you're on a medication that suppresses your immune system, like steroids. And so those are people that we want to be more cautious about, because even though they can safely get the vaccine, they may be in that group that are just less likely to have really potent protection. And that's the goal of herd immunity, right? We protect the people that have less robust immune systems so that even if they aren't going to be fully protected, the rest of the herd will protect them.
And Andrea, the elderly are in that group too, as well, right? They don't mount as potent of an immune response.
Right, exactly.
So let's move on to this next one. This is a great question. Luke from Madison, Wisconsin would like to know, how are you feeling about the idea that the spread of the B117 variant or the UK variant might complicate back to school issues? we're planning that our 8-year-old daughter will go back to school next week. And actually here in Madison, probably since Luke submitted this question, we had a big outbreak of that variant in a daycare setting. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky situation, right? So the B117 variant is more transmissible in all groups, right? Across the whole population. And they're estimating right now it could be anywhere from 50% to 100% more transmissible. And what that means is that people generally are more able to spread it to others. So case numbers might rise more rapidly because infections will spread more quickly. But one of the other interesting things is normally children, especially children younger than 10, were not significant drivers of infection, right? They were not getting infected as frequently. They were not transmitting the virus to others as frequently, but that doesn't seem to be the case in this variant. So this variant seems to also be very effective at infecting children, and children are also very effective at transmitting it to other people. And so what that means is as we're vaccinating more and more adults, we're shifting the demographics of who can transmit the virus to a younger population. And many people, many parents, many people generally assumed, okay, kids are not a big risk. And that was true with the previous version of the virus, but it's not the case with this version. So what that means is we have to be more stringent with mitigation measures among children. It's not to say that they can't go back to school, they can't go to daycare, but things like masking and distancing are going to be absolutely critical in those populations so that we can make sure that we don't lead to these wide scale outbreaks among children.
And we are concerned about this variant, to be perfectly honest. It is now the prevalent strain of the virus in this country. I think 50 to 60% of cases we're seeing are this B117. And we saw, I forget, Andrea, was it Michigan? If you look at the age group 10 to 19, there was a 133% increase in cases among that age group. We're seeing outbreaks across the country linked to gatherings of children, whether it be school or extracurricular activities. And as Andrea said, I'm a mom, I have 2 young kids, and I've balanced the risks and the benefits of sending them back to school. And ultimately I did decide to send them back to school. But you have to be cognizant of those risks. Malia, you were saying we're not eliminating the risk, but you have to understand, do you have very high risk people in your household? Is your school requiring masks? Are they, improving ventilation? There are so many things to consider. So the short answer is, does this have implications for children and gatherings of children? Yes, it does. It doesn't mean that we automatically close down all schools again, but it's something to definitely have on our radar.
And I think, the other thing here to consider is that children are not yet able to be vaccinated. So they are going to remain a susceptible population, both themselves, but also the people they encounter. And that really underscores why we want to get as many adults vaccinated as we can, because even if the kids are spreading it amongst themselves, we can halt the chain of transmission, at least amongst adults, and reduce the overall disease burden.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's going to be a bit before we can get kids into, the vaccine eligible age groups. Those trials are underway, but we don't expect them to be available for younger kids younger than 16 until, I would say minimum end of the summer for the older group, and much longer than that for the younger ones. So yeah, it'll be a while.
Pfizer did just submit to the FDA on Friday review of their pediatric 12 to 15 age group. So that review should happen in the near future. They want to get their authorization amended so that 12 and above can be vaccinated. But again, that would only hold true for Pfizer. And of course, we still have, limitations getting the previously eligible age groups vaccinated. So it will be still a little bit of time.
Yeah. So we're almost out of time here, but I want to ask you one last question, kind of a big one. What do you see as the biggest challenge of the present moment where we are in the pandemic?
So I think for me, the biggest challenge is people dealing with pandemic fatigue. So pandemic fatigue is not just physically being tired, but being tired of implementing mitigation measures and being vigilant. You know, we're seeing people, vaccinated, unvaccinated alike, getting more and more complacent, relaxing, the measures that they were previously implementing really well, checking who's in your quarantine bubble, who you're interacting with indoors, what activities you're willing to do. People in general, whether or not they're vaccinated, are becoming much more relaxed with that. And that, in combination with the more transmissible variants, which are now dominant in the US, is a recipe for disaster when we're at this tipping point, right? We don't have enough people vaccinated yet. We're making progress, but we're not there yet. I think as of yesterday, it was about 20% of the US population was fully vaccinated and about 33% were partially vaccinated. That's not enough yet. That's not enough to slow the spread. And while the vaccines are effective against these new variants, we still need to kind of keep it under control until we get enough people vaccinated. So even if you're vaccinated, you still have to wear masks in public. You still want to be careful of how many people and who you're interacting with. And we have to hold on for at least a little bit longer. The next probably 2 months are going to be really critical in this.
I agree. Pandemic fatigue is a real problem. And the other thing is that I feel like we really are in this race between the vaccinations and the virus, right? And as Andrea just pointed out, we're dealing with these variants and these mutations. Right now, we have more demand for vaccines than we have supply. But I think in the next couple of months, that's going to flip-flop, and soon we'll be dealing with a chunk of the population that's just completely resistant to getting vaccinations. And then our hurdle is going to be convincing those people and trying to reduce vaccine hesitancy. So I think it's super important for there to be emphasis on scientific communication through Dear Pandemic, through unbiased science. People need trusted sources. We know that the internet is, stomping ground for misinformation and the rapid spread of pseudoscience. So I think we're going to need to get creative in how we approach tackling this vaccine hesitancy, because the reasons for hesitation are so varied based on the different subpopulation. And so I think really this is public health time to shine and step up scientific communication efforts.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree. This, I see a lot of pandemic fatigue at play. And I actually think, we get a ton of questions about this issue of wearing masks after you're vaccinated. And if we really think that the vaccines prevent infection, then what's the point of wearing masks? And I want to highlight a couple of things there with respect to pandemic fatigue. Like, yes, we all want to throw our masks on a bonfire already, but two things. We don't know for sure yet how many asymptomatic infections the vaccines prevent, because that wasn't part of the trials, right? That wasn't a question in the trials. And two, part of wearing a mask in public is signaling that we're all still wearing masks, right? It's actually just important to keep doing it for the benefit of all the people who are not vaccinated, because we need to signal that those people also need to continue wearing masks over these next critical 2 months. Make it to the end of this race between these new variants and the vaccines. It is a little bit of a scary time, and we're so exhausted by being scared already. So it's tough.
Yeah, absolutely. You make a great point, Malia. It's a lot of it is this sociological, we're all in this together. We're protecting each other. We're being safe in public. And, we do have a little bit of real world data, but of course that real world data is also married with the fact that people are wearing masks. And so we don't know outside of mask wearing what that true potential for transmission or asymptomatic infection is.
Right. Okay, well, we are out of time. Thanks so much for joining me. I have been chatting with Dr. Andrea Love, who is a PhD immunologist, and Dr. Jess Steyer, who is a PhD in public health. I'm Malia Jones. I'm the editor-in-chief at Dear Pandemic, and we tackled a bunch of great questions today. There were a lot more questions that we did not get to. There always are. So if you put a question in our question box and we didn't get to it, know that we do read them all and we use them to plan what we're going to post about for the next week. So look for our page and also the page at Unbiased Science Podcast to see if we've answered your question. Also, one more thank you to Bridges for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing for providing the ASL interpretation and CART services, so we can be more inclusive and provide this information for more people. And if you have been using those services, I'd love if you would just let us know in the comments. That's really useful for us. So thanks for joining us. I'll be back at the same time next week. It's Saturday at 9:30 Central every weekend. And I don't know who my guests are going to be next week because I forgot to look. So it'll be a surprise. We'll see who it is. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for
Thank you.
having
Thanks so
us.
much.